Okay, welcome back everyone to CPG's podcast, The Supply Chain of Thought. My name is Laura Dow, and I'm here again with CPG's founder and CEO, Michael DeClercq. And today we are doing something a little different. Michael, welcome back.
Thank you, Laura. Great to be back and interested to learn more about what we're doing different. What are we doing different?
That's right. So we just got back from a fun trade show. I guess it was more like a supply chain show, the American Supply Chain Summit in Dallas. And we thought it would be interesting to share some of the key takeaways and insights from the event. We met with dozens of companies, large companies such as Procter & Gamble and smaller companies. And we heard a lot of fascinating input from everyone. And so that is the idea for today. How does that sound?
Sounds great. I think anybody involved in the supply chain would be interested in this topic.
Excellent. So in the past, with our first two podcasts, we did use this IDS format where we had a topic and we identify the topic, discuss it, and solve. We're going to do something more casual today. It's going to be a discussion about the key themes that we heard from attendees of the show. And so I just wanted to tell listeners about that change. And before we get started, I did want to give a shout out to ASCS because we enjoyed the format quite a bit. They focus on building relationships, networking. They guarantee these one-on-one meetings. And so we were able to meet with at least 10 great companies and have these interesting conversations with them. So I did want to share that for anyone looking for a great event to meet people in their industry or related industries. This Generis event was pretty good.
Yeah, I agree with that, Laura. I found it interesting. I think most people that attend these events, they do it for networking reasons. I think they did a very good job helping participants and visitors achieve that networking effect by not leaving it to them, kind of thing, by organizing and committing to putting people together based on their needs and their offerings. So that I agree with you. That was a good format and they did a pretty good job at it.
And we are looking into another show, perhaps in Europe later this year. Stay tuned for information about that. So going into the show, it was a difficult time for global trade. It still is. But, at the time of our attendance at the show, that was May 1st and 2nd in Dallas, tariffs on goods from China were over 150%. And if I think most listeners know that we focus on sourcing from China, and many companies in the United States do as well. The majority, I would say. So very difficult situation. And we had to go into the event with a game plan, a key theme. And ours was basically that the situation is very difficult. We all recognize that. And we had a question, our question was, can you still thrive amidst this chaos, the US-China trade standoff? That was the question that we were asking. We even had a banner asking that question. And it elicited a lot of, I think, feedback. People stopped by our booth and asked us our thoughts on this. And so, Michael, what do you think about this? What was our theme around this?
Well, first, obviously, I think it was a good question to ask. You used the word more than 150% tariffs on products coming from China. I think what you mean is that for some products, the 145% is what the Trump administration came up with. But I think for some products, that's significantly higher than that. Am I right?
That's true. So there's this layering effect for these tariffs. And so you have an initial tariff and then another tariff layered on top of that. And then some industries are, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not subjected to tariffs. They have a waiver.
Yeah. So it's a little bit all over the place. But
right.
But certainly when you're dealing with 145% tariffs, frankly, that's as near to an embargo as you can get.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps more important is the uncertainty of the tariff situation. Because if you have, for example, an embargo, you have an embargo. Can you thrive under an embargo? The answer is no, you can't. By definition, an embargo means you can't do trade, pretty much. So the questions, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I guess, that we were saying is, hey, you can thrive. Can you thrive? Yes, you can. But how do you do it? And And it really had to do with the uncertainty. And so I think a lot of people, first of all, I found it interesting to see how many people were impacted by this tariff thing, because it's, we tend to be focused at CPG on the China tariffs, but, people were horrified by tariffs on Canada and goods coming from Mexico and places like Vietnam. It's, tariffs against our European allies, tariffs everywhere. I mean, this is what frazzled a lot of people. And then the question was, well, I mean, thriving is the last thing you can think about. How can you thrive? And of course, our point of view is in chaos, some companies thrive, and they thrive because of the chaos, and more to the point, because they're prepared to deal with the chaos, and because they kept their feet on the ground and they didn't allow panic to take over. And so their thriving isn't so much a marketplace effect. Their thriving has to do with how they compete with the other guys. And because the marketplace stays there, and their ability to chart a course and proceed accordingly is what I guess makes them thrive.
Yeah, I think that's helpful nuance. And I guess also some more clarification for listeners is that we also went to the event knowing that this too shall pass. Unless there was going to be a long-term embargo and trade between US, China, and our favorite neighbors was going to come to a complete halt, it was going to pass. And so really it was, companies should focus on short-term mitigation of the impacts and then also stay focused on their long-term strategy. But I think nobody there most people assumed that it could not last forever.
Yeah, I found that very interesting because when the government says what it said about reciprocal tariffs, about minimum tariffs on aluminum and steel, about tariffs on close allies, you kind of think, that's it. That's what's going to stay. And you would imagine that most people assume that indeed, the whole global trade economy has forever changed. But as you said, Laura, most people didn't see it that way. Most people were very sanguine, if I can use that word, about the fact that it can't last. It will change. And when you try to pin them down to, why they thought that way, most of them would pull back and say, look, we can't be sure, but logic dictates that it can't last. And so, you would engage in typically short conversations because that's really not a big thing they wanted to talk about. But generally, they thought that politically it was going to be unsustainable because tariffs are going to create inflation. There's no doubt in anybody's mind. I didn't meet one person who didn't think that the cost of tariffs was going to be borne by the end user ultimately. I mean, you had OEMs there, you had various levels of manufacturers, you had retailers, you had, entities like you said, Laura, Amazon. Everybody knew that tariffs were going to be paid by the person who buys the finished product, the end user. And therefore, it was going to be inflationary and politically unsustainable. That seemed to be the rationale for people's optimism.
Agree. Something I also found surprising, I guess for me, prior to the event, there was a lot of focus on how the tariffs at the current rates at that time they were an existential threat for small companies. They would go out of business. There was less focus, I think, on large companies. And so I was curious to hear the thoughts of these large companies, leaders of these large companies at the event. And really the takeaway was it was a shared pain. Even the largest, global 500 companies cannot avoid the pain of these tariffs. So if you have millions of dollars on the water, Toshiba shared a story with an audience. They were a speaker at the event. Basically, they had a situation in which they had to pay the 150+% tariffs, and it was a huge it was a huge hit to them. And even a company of that size, it's not going to bankrupt them, but they can't sustain it. So that was
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think, that was indeed interesting. But on the other hand, it doesn't take long to figure out that small companies are going to suffer more. And typically, their suffering typically can result in bankruptcy, going out of business. And we certainly heard a lot about that. There was, of course, there's a lot more in terms of numbers, small companies than there are big ones. And all these small companies were scrambling to find solutions. The big ones, as you said, Laura, some of them suffered, like Toshiba. But again, if you're big, first of all, you've got much bigger financial reserves. You tend to have a more dominant position in the marketplace, which also allows you to transfer costs, down the line. And also, potentially, you could use a lobby with the US government and maybe get waivers, which we've certainly seen for certain large companies in the US. Toshiba, being a Japanese one, probably didn't benefit from that lobby power, I'm guessing. But again, in my view, the pain was felt mostly by small companies.
Want expert insight on your supply chain? Schedule a free consultation with CPG Sourcing. CPG partners with companies across all industries importing from China. With over 46 years of sourcing expertise and a dedicated team on the ground, we help you secure high-quality products at the best price delivered on time. Visit cpgsourcing.com/book a call to see how we can strengthen your supply chain for resilience and sustainability. Mention Supply Chain of Thought when you reach out to receive 10 extra resource hours in your first month. That's cpgsourcing.com/book a call.
right. But large companies were very unhappy about it as well. I think
True.
we went into the event thinking that perhaps we might meet some people that were supportive of the tariffs or thought that they were.
Did not meet one person who was supportive.
I want to shift gears here because we've been talking about, short-term solutions to this chaos. And I want to then discuss some of the positive trends that we saw, more exciting trends at the event related to AI and ESG, and specifically also how we, CPG, might be able to help even some of the largest companies. It was exciting for us to see this, that we might have a place to help them to be a piece of their puzzle. So just to set the stage, I attended an event 3 years ago with our client success manager, Gartner. Michael, you weren't with us at the time. Gartner supply chain event, and I believe it was in Orlando. And AI was a huge topic. And at that time, 3 years ago, AI was going to be the miracle solution to solve all supply chain problems, predictive analytics. Large corporations were going to use all this data to predict inventory needs, and it was going to manage the entire supply chain. It was also a focus at this event, but there was a big shift. And we noticed that the topic this year was focused more on quality of data, data verification. Everyone was concerned about GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Michael, did you agree with that? You saw that as well?
Yeah, I mean, walking the show was very interesting. A lot of the exhibitors had the word or the letters AI featured in a big way in their booths. And AI was, I would say, a big factor for, I'm not scientific about this, but that was my impression. At least 60% of the people there prominently featured AI. And of course, it's an interesting, AI is part of our world now, and it's an interesting thing to think about. And you kind of wonder, to what extent does AI contribute to the supply chain or to the management of the supply chain? And there's many very creative ways that it does contribute. And people advocate for it, and they point out how it can save money, significant amounts of money, which basically would be ways to optimize and the way you run your supply chain. But the Achilles heel of that argument is the quality of data. And we had brief conversations with people about that, and they would admit, I mean, one of the problems with AI is hallucinations, right? I mean, you can't use a system if you can't trust it. And when they get down to it, they would tell us in no uncertain term that the key issue becomes quality of data. One company that I think emphasized this during one of their talks was Bosch, right, of Germany. And it seems to be, it's a factor, but at least my impression, Laura, is that people were kind of reluctant to talk about it, mostly because they didn't know how to fix it. And of course, we at CPG, we specialize in the first segment of the supply chain, which is, how they talk about supply chain and they always emphasize the last mile. There is this big emphasis on that part of it. We're the first mile.
Right.
But if you look in terms of data control, data management, a lot of the stuff comes from that first segment. And so we found it quite interesting to see that a lot of people would be interested in using our services to understand and to improve the quality of that data, which involves, the thing about China is that China can be quite obscure. It's not as easy to obtain data from China as it is to obtain, say, from data from Europe, for example, and or from the US, obviously. But that's something that we're very good at and we've done for a very long time. And so they were interested in finding ways to improve that quality of data in order to improve their AI models and to improve the accuracy of their AI models. Right. I thought that was very interesting, yes.
Yes, I guess I didn't notice that people were reluctant to talk about it, but it was a little bit glossed over. So, again, 3 years ago at Gartner, everything was AI. And Chris and I were walking around, hi, we're the people behind the data, or we're the people in the processes to implement the AI or to use the data or interpret the data. And I will admit, we felt kind of silly, that we weren't as advanced and we weren't as high tech and we were just human beings type thing. But at this show, even the largest companies, and I think Bosch was one of, during the presentation, there was data. And then the next slide or section was people and processes. And then because you need that step. And there was also a lot of discussion or some discussion about blockchain. And you're right. When looking at the entire supply chain, maybe the majority of the data, much of the data comes from that first segment. Everything from verifying that a supplier exists where they say they exist on paper, where are your goods actually coming from, and how many subcontractors is that supplier using, what the quality of those materials, and then of course, really important these days, environmental social governance compliance, how do you verify all that data? So the only way to do it, I think, is people, having people there, eyeballs.
When I say reluctant, Laura, I meant, a lot of these people, of course, what were they there for? They were there to sell, right? Their product. And when you sell your AI, you don't want to point out its weaknesses. It's only when you start saying, well, wait, like this whole system this whole AI thing that you guys are selling, which is very exciting, but it's GIGO, as you said. If your data input, which again, they didn't want to emphasize, but if your data input is questionable, then obviously the output becomes questionable. And again, if you focus on which input is the least easy, if you want to verify, to obtain good quality, it's, as far as the China supply chain is concerned, it's the first segment of the China supply chain that is difficult because it requires pretty much, like you said, Laura, it requires eyeballs, verification at factory level, or in different elements of the early stage of the supply chain. And that's difficult data to obtain. But it's necessary for these AI models.
Yes. Okay, so now we're on the same page. I was speaking of the companies, the attendees and presenters that were companies buying products and needing to verify the data and using AI. They were talking about the need for quality data. And you are correct. I do think some of the exhibitors, other service providers that, were using AI as a service as part of, to manage the supply chain, they were reluctant to go into that as we can understand.
Yeah.
So that was an exciting takeaway for us. I think that, even for the largest companies, so we often talk at CPG, how could we help a company like Pepsi, for example, or these multinational household names, how can we help them? But if they're buying from thousands of suppliers, we can help them go through that list one by one and do some validation of the suppliers and their location and really anything that they need confirmed on the ground.
Right. And like you said, ESG, I found, Laura, to be interesting because, of course, it's not the flavor of the month anymore. At least, that's the feeling we're getting. But there seems to be, even though it's not bandied about as a big issue anymore, I think a lot of people kind of embraced it and kind of bragged about their ESG credentials. They don't do that as much. But I also noticed that a lot of people still were intent on implementing ESG. And here again, obviously some companies were more willing to talk about that than others, but here again you have an element of verification, which certainly on the China side is more difficult to do. And again, something that we've done before and we've done for many companies, and it's, I guess from my point of view, it was good to know that people still cared about how their goods were manufactured, and many brands had the pride of what went into their product. And we saw it again. I think it was Bosch. They had a very interesting example about a factory in India that had a completely circular economy.
Yes.
And it was fascinating to see how, again, under the leadership of a big buyer, you could make a difference. And what struck me is, the old adage, quality is free. Well, it looks like environmentally friendly products can be free too, once you put the systems in place. And was a nice thing to observe.
I agree. I think it was, I guess, in my conversations with companies at the event, and then even since, for me, it's not that maybe it's being talked about less because from my perspective, it's more normalized. And so it's it's integrated, it's expected. Clients of our clients of the companies who attended the event are requiring this. And so it's just becoming like an organic label on vegetables, something that most people want and most people expect. I don't know, maybe most is optimistic, but many people, it's more common these days. I think, just to finish this topic, something that I found quite interesting, we had a great conversation with someone from Amazon's Climate Pledge Initiative, and I was particularly surprised that there were only 550, I think it's now 566 signatories that had signed on to this climate pledge, which has pretty stringent requirements. But there's thousands and thousands of companies that sell on Amazon. And I asked, the attendee, why is this? And she explained that, really data verification, to meet these, to be in compliance with the pledge requires a lot of work, frankly. And people just don't have the transparency in their supply chain, or they're not able to meet the requirements. So that was interesting. I'm going to be watching that initiative and seeing, over time, I think you'll see more and more companies joining that climate pledge. And I think consumers, when they go buy on Amazon, will be filtering with that, climate pledge filter, so that they're buying from companies that are taking ESG into consideration or very seriously.
I think a lot of business people in the past looked at ESG and kind of poo-pooed it because they used the simple metric of price. And they said, look, if you confront a consumer with apples, apples to apples, and you tell them, here's a pair of socks made in a good way, and here's a cheap one. Which one are you going to buy, assuming the quality is basically equal? Their attitude was that 99% of the market would buy the cheap version. It proved not to be entirely true, and we've seen this manifested in many different ways. But what's also interesting is what I said earlier, which is that if you put these systems in place, it doesn't, at the beginning, there is a capital expenditure element perhaps, but ultimately it doesn't cost more to make those items. Doesn't necessarily cost more.
Right.
To make those items. And it's counterintuitive. A lot of people thought that, alternative fuels cost a lot more, therefore nobody's going to use them. And then governments forced them through. And what's happening now is that alternative fuels are cheaper than fossil fuels. And that's just to illustrate my point. You can make merchandise in an ESG way that is not necessarily more expensive in the long run than making it in whatever, the quote unquote bad way.
Right. And that was also, we saw quite a few presentations that did focus on that. You mentioned already the Bosch, the company and manufacturing plant in India. And there was also a lot of data supporting ESG and the cost savings. So once you have it in place, the savings achieved from a circular economy is impressive. So it is changing. It's really, really exciting.
And it's a leadership thing. And so when you have companies that insist on this, what they're doing is they're exporting their culture to those third world countries or to these developing countries. And a big beneficiary tends to be them, the workers of these circular factories. They're happy, they're proud of what they're doing. We've seen this on the ground in China, and to a certain extent, if the buyers didn't have those requirements, then the change wouldn't occur, I think.
Right. It's definitely been a highlight for me since starting at CPG. Of course, we can do all the standard sourcing, supply chain management, but this shift towards sustainability, circular purchasing and economy is wonderful. And it's also a way that we can help. We can help with that verification of compliance on the ground. And I hope the trend continues and grows.
Yeah. No, I agree. And again, I thought this ASCS was a very interesting show. It was a chance to meet a broad range of people. Even some Chinese people were there. And that gave you, Laura, a chance to speak a little bit of Mandarin, which is probably something that you don't get to do very often anymore. And, I don't know, you mentioned COVID. There's I wanted to sort of jump in and make an interesting little comment about COVID, because a lot of people, well, at least some of the people that I spoke to, equated this period of the Trump administration with 2020, which is when COVID started. And they said, look, economically speaking, it's a disaster, just like when Trump was, in charge of the US economy in 2020. And they made a lot of parallels, including the ones you made about freight and everything else. But I thought that was ironic that they would make those parallels. And if you look for them, you'll find articles about that. I think I read one in The Economist about it, which was interesting. But in the end, my view is that tariffs, if they're here to stay, are going to dramatically change the US economy in a way that COVID never could. And it's going to last a lot longer. Okay, but that's my opinion.
So let's end on a more positive note. Anything from the show? Any final comments from the show that you want to share, comment on? I think we covered it pretty well.
No, I think, look, there's a strong element of resiliency in the
Yes.
supply chain, the US supply chain. They tend to be positive thinkers. You have people that advocate, use my system, you can save 2% or maybe 7%. And when you think, wait, we're in an environment that talks about minimum 10% tariffs and 145% tariffs, who cares about saving 2%? And the answer is, in the long run, the successful companies care about that, and they don't believe that these crazy tariffs are gonna permeate the U.S. environment forever. So we met a broad range of very interesting people. It was a good experience.
I agree. And I almost mentioned that earlier. I mean, there was obviously discussions about the tariffs, but there was this underlying belief that they weren't going to last. And so it was almost like they didn't exist. I mean, it was a short-term pain. And so the conversations about resilience longer term were quite different, and they were related to diversification, finding alternative regions to purchase from in Vietnam, India, and elsewhere. And we'll talk about that during another podcast. But overall, it was a great event. It was great to have you there, Michael. Special to have you there, because I think that was the first event you've attended with us, right?
Yeah, probably was, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was a pleasure to be there and to see all you guys at work, and also to see the interaction with the American supply chain service providers. I think it was very interesting, very enlightening for me.
Good. Well, thank you, everybody, for tuning in to our Supply Chain of Thought podcast. Until next time, stay informed, stay agile, and feel free to, send us any comments. If we said something that's inaccurate, we'd be happy to hear your feedback. Feel free to send us an email. My email is ld@cpgsourcing.com. Until next time, bye, Michael.
Bye.
Shout out to our friends at Kickfurther, the best way to get funding for 100% of your inventory without taking on debt or giving up equity. Kickfurther puts you in control of your business, eliminates stockouts, keep up with demand, and move into growth mode. Visit kickfurther.com today.